Mrs. Webber and Newton's First Law of Motion, a fun and hilarious physics class. It was a bright Tuesday afternoon, and Mrs. Webber's physics class was as lively as ever. The 12-year-olds, an enthusiastic mix of boys and girls, were bouncing in their seats, knowing their quirky teacher always had something wild up her sleeve. "All right, class," Mrs. Webber began, her glasses perched on her head as if they were preparing to take flight. "Today we're diving into Newton's first law of motion, also known as, drum roll please." The kids pounded their desks in unison. "The law of inertia," she exclaimed with jazz hands. "Is that like when my cat refuses to move off my laptop?" asked Luke, the class comedian. Mrs. Webber grinned. "Exactly, Luke. Newton would say an object at rest stays at rest unless acted upon by an external force. In this case, the external force is you yelling, 'Get off, you fluffy tyrant!'" The class erupted into laughter. "But wait," she continued, pacing dramatically like a detective unveiling a mystery. "There's more. The law also says an object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an external force. So, if your cat starts zooming around at 3 a.m, nothing will stop it except maybe a wall." "Now, time for some real science," she declared, wheeling out a cart covered with a cloth like a magician about to perform a disappearing act. Underneath were a book, a toy car, a ball and a tablecloth. "Let's start with a classic. Who wants to help me prove Newton wasn't just making stuff up?" Every hand shot up. She picked Maya, the go-to volunteer who approached with the confidence of someone who believed she could win a Nobel Prize today. "Maya, put this book on the cloth. Now pull the cloth out as fast as you can without moving the book." Maya hesitated. "What if I mess up and it all goes flying?" Mrs. Webber raised a brow. "Then we'll blame it on Newton and not on your coordination." Maya yanked the cloth, and to everyone's astonishment, the book stayed put. The class erupted in cheers. "See? Magic? Nope. Physics. The book stayed at rest because of its inertia. It resists movement, kind of like me when my alarm goes off at 6 a.m. Ben piped up, "Can I try? I want to see what happens if I pull it really hard." Mrs. Webber sighed. "Ben, you're the reason science teachers get hazard pay. Fine, but remember, Newton's laws don't cover broken noses." Ben gave it a dramatic yank. The book stayed put again, but the cloth ended up in his lap. "I'm a genius," he declared. "No, Ben," Mrs. Webber replied with a smirk. "Newton is. You're just good at following instructions." "Now," Mrs. Webber said, holding up the ball, "let's talk about where you see this law in real life. Who's got an example?" "My skateboard," yelled Ethan. "Spot on. When you're zooming down a hill, you keep going until friction, a rock, or gravity says, nope. Although," she added, "if it's a rock, the law of inertia might also send you flying into a bush. Bonus, you'll learn about Newton's second law firsthand." "Seatbelts in cars," shouted Sarah. "Exactly. When the car stops suddenly, your body wants to keep going forward, thanks inertia, but the seatbelt yanks you back. Physics saves the day, and possibly your face." Luke raised his hand. "So if I don't start my homework, does inertia mean I'll just never do it?" The class erupted again. Mrs. Webber shook her head. "Nice try, Luke, but no. That's called procrastination, and the external force to fix it is me giving you detention." "Does this apply to my little brother eating cake?" asked Julia. "He doesn't stop unless he's physically removed from the kitchen." "Absolutely," Mrs. Webber replied. "Inertia at its finest. He's an object in motion until someone, usually your mom, applies a force." "But what about the future?" "Excellent question. Scientists are using this law in space exploration. In space, there's no air to slow things down, so objects just keep moving forever, like astronauts." "Can astronauts play soccer in space?" Maya asked. "Sure," Mrs. Webber replied, "but the ball wouldn't stop until it hit something. So I hope they like infinite games of fetch. Luke raised his hand again. Does that mean if I launch my homework into space, it'll keep going forever? Mrs. Webber sighed. Luke, if you put as much effort into doing homework as you do into avoiding it, you'd be a billionaire by now. Now let's see if you've been paying attention, Mrs. Webber said, picking up her marker. Quiz time, and if you ace it, no homework tonight. The class whooped with excitement. First question, why does a soccer ball stop rolling after you kick it? Friction, yelled Ethan. Correct, and also because I kicked it into my neighbour's yard. Not part of the law, but fair point, Mrs. Webber replied, laughing. Next question, what happens to your body when a car suddenly stops and why? You keep moving forward because of inertia, Sarah answered. Spot on, and if you're not wearing a seatbelt, Newton might give you a very personal lesson in face planting. Last question, Mrs. Webber said with a sly smile. What law makes Luke stay in bed until his mom yells at him? Inertia. Brilliant! And because you all nailed it, no homework tonight. The room erupted in cheers, and as the bell rang, the students poured out of the classroom, still laughing and sharing stories about inertia in their own lives.